Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stacey Flier. I'm a principal on the private wealth team at NEPC, and I'd like to welcome you to our first ever private wealth expert series on the topic of next generation engagement. We are thrilled to have Jennifer Strom and Josh Nacht joining us from the Family Business Consulting Group to discuss this topic. The decision to feature this topic was born out of conversations with our clients. Many of you are in the process of a generational transition, and NEPC has assisted clients with discussing wealth and investments with the next generation. However, the topic of next generation engagement spans more than just money, which is why this discussion will broaden the conversation. Before I turn it over to Jennifer and Josh, a few housekeeping notes. First, please note that this will be recorded and available to watch after the event, so please feel free to share. Second, we really would like to make this conversational, so please put questions that you have in the questions box, which if you look at your panel on the right there, it's right underneath polls and right above chat. And I will be monitoring that, and we'll ask Jennifer and Josh questions throughout. We'll also have some time at the end for Q&A. And finally, we do want to have future editions of the Private Wealth Expert Series featuring both NEPC experts and external experts on topics that are important to you. So if anyone has suggestions regarding topics they'd like to see for future events, please let your consultant know. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Jennifer and Josh to introduce themselves and go through their presentation.
Thanks, Stacey. I'll start things off. As Stacey said, my name is Joshua Nacht. I'm a principal consultant with the Family Business Consulting Group. We work exclusively with business owning and operating families. So that means families that have an operating business, families who may have had a liquidity event and are managing shared assets together, who may have a family office, and who may be doing philanthropy, may have a foundation together, and kind of all of the combinations thereof. I primarily work with families to help them get more intentional and clear about what they want, and then to also help them build the structures, the governance, the agreements in order to fulfill their vision. I live in Colorado. I live in a small town called Lyons, which is just north of Boulder. I have a background leading wilderness trips, a master's degree in counseling, and a PhD in organizational systems. And I love working with family enterprises and families because it's some of the most complex and challenging work with some of the things that mean the most to people, you know, their money, their business, and their family. And I find the intersection of all that really fascinating, challenging, and rewarding work.
Hello, everyone. Similar to Josh, I work with clients who are navigating next generational transitions. So transitions, the way we look at governance and structure is making decisions about assets. So that could be making decisions about a business. It could be making decisions about shared assets from a liquidity event. It can be around a foundation. It could be about shared real estate assets. It could be about shared investments, but we are always working with clients to figure out how to come together and make the best decisions. And where my focus is on doing that with an attention to wealth and values, as well as an attention to how we protect both assets and family relationships along the way. My background is as an MBA. I graduated from Kellogg, and I also have a master's in family systems therapy. So I make sense as to why I'm viewing decisions around assets about both people and structure. I live in Connecticut, but I also have family in Colorado, so I spend time going back and forth between Connecticut and Colorado, and my clients are really everywhere. And like Josh, I really enjoy this work because it pulls both the structure of the business decisions and decisions around assets and financial decisions into the world of family dynamics and how we support relationships, especially as we're transitioning over generations. So thank you, Stacey, for inviting me and Josh to this conversation. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who's going to kick off our presentation. And I do want to reiterate one thing that Stacey said earlier. We're going to leave time open at the end to questions, but we also do welcome questions throughout. That actually works really well for both me and Josh. So I'll turn that over to Josh to start the presentation, and we'll take it from there.
All right, so our main topic today is next generation engagement for continuity, which is sort of a mouthful. But we're really talking about our ideas and approaches and mindsets, strategies to get the next generation, whatever that may be second, third, fourth generation. It may also just be the next cohort, because I think that as the generations go, and you all know, sometimes those generations get such a large age spread, it's easier to talk about cohorts rather than strict generations. But we are talking about the next people involved with the family, how to get them engaged, active, thinking, contributing, so you support continuity, support the longevity of the family and the family's involvements with their assets. Within that topic, we're going to talk about 5 things, as you can see. The importance of ownership alignment, which we see as vital to the success of any family enterprise. And when I say family enterprise, I mean that broadly. I mean how the family gathers together to steward their shared assets, their shared business. So I use that as kind of an umbrella term. We'll really talk about, within alignment, the importance of next gen purpose and vision. They need to have a reason why they're doing this work and a vision for what their goals are. The impact of wealth, something we know that you work with quite a bit. Some ideas around education and engagement, and then also the importance of building relationships and connection, because as a family, none of this works without strong relationships and the sense of connection together. So fundamentally, successful family businesses, successful family enterprises work towards stability and alignment. Now, a lot of forces in the family can push towards instability and a lack of alignment if left unaddressed. And what we mean by that is that families, especially as they grow, naturally have more perspectives, a wider age spread, and they aren't always held together by a singular leader. As you move towards a shared leadership model, you'll really see that there can be divergent perspectives and divergent views on what directions things should take. That is, if left unattended to. And so what we see successful family businesses doing is together creating areas of alignment. They create areas particularly around values, what it means the most to you as a family, what sort of culture would you like to have? They create agreements and norms around communication. And that's also the process of communicating, that the best families come together, they talk about these matters, they do so in a way that's fair and effective. And that really leads to collaboration. Collaboration doesn't always happen naturally. Sometimes there needs to be a lot of facilitation and a lot of appreciation of those different perspectives, and arriving at consensus, because that to us is an essential part of collaboration, that you arrive at something that everybody can live with. In the beginning of family businesses, oftentimes there's a singular decision maker. One person gets their way and everybody falls into line behind that, but that doesn't really work for a larger family, and it doesn't work for a multi-generational family. So we really support the idea of collaboration as an essential element. All of that, your values, communication, and collaboration can help create a structure of the agreements that everybody is developing and living. And it's also a governance structure. It's how do you make decisions? How does a family come together to make ownership level decisions? Sometimes those are small, and sometimes they're of the utmost importance if you're talking about board members, capital allocation, and some pieces like that. All of this creates continuity, but continuity doesn't happen on its own. Continuity happens as the result of strategic thinking, where the family is able to say, this is where we want to go, and here are some tactical ways about how we get there. So it's the strategy to have a big picture, and then it's action planning and tactical planning to say, what are the things that we need to do to actually achieve those goals? And that's continuity. It's not an event, it's very much an ongoing process. Jen, anything to add on that, or any examples of families that you've worked with that have done this?
Well, I think that in listening to Josh, what I think about is really the idea of doing this with intention. So I was currently working with a family who was actually G6 in a family business, but really G1, because somebody in the family business had chosen to reinvest some of the capital in a new business, and recently it had a liquidity event. So they had to make choices about what they were going to do moving forward. So the G1 of this new business had a liquidity event, and they had a large amount of capital that they were going to be making decisions about. And there are many areas that they needed to think through, but where we really started was with what the family values were. So what were they trying to do? What was the reason for coming together with G2, who had recently had their own G3, who were babies? There were new spouses coming into the system, so they had a large amount of liquidity that they were now looking to do a few things with. One was going to be investing, some together, some separately. They needed to figure out how to structure those assets within trust. They also wanted to figure out how to come together, like you mentioned earlier, Josh, with the foundation and how to tie the values to what they were doing there. And it was very important to them to maintain the entrepreneurial spirit of the company. So in looking at, of the family. So in looking at moving forward with continuity, they wanted to create governance around very intentionally how they would be making decisions about investing in new businesses together and separately, and creating guardrails moving forward. So I liked what you had said about doing this really intentionally in order to protect the continuity of assets and relationships over time, because without those discussions, they would have been moving rather directionless. But by starting with the values and thinking about what did they want to do with these assets, we were able to be very intentional around continuity. So.
Yeah, and I think that what Jennifer just shared and the work that we do is essentially as facilitators. We're helping facilitate these conversations. We're helping bring structure to what can be very complex and confusing work, and helping families walk through it in a way that's manageable and sensible. It makes sense. And you can see all these bullet points below. These are all pieces that we work with families to develop so they can create the structure for their long-term success. And there's not a template here, but there certainly is a process that we walk through. And Stacey, this goes to the next slide, where we think it's really fundamental to start with the why. Why do you want to continue to work together as family members? Why is it important to steward your assets? You could just outsource all of this. Some families have that capability, like family office will do it or NEPC will do it. We don't have to do it. And I think a lot of families, though, do want to be highly involved. The question is why? And what do you want? What is your purpose? What is your vision? And when families can articulate that and develop statements and this sense of purpose, we find it's really powerful because it gives them the goal. It gives them the reasons why they're doing this. And certainly individuals may have their own reasons, and that's appropriate. There needs to be some alignment around a common purpose, a common vision. And so we really start with that as a really essential place to begin and develop that consensus. Then to achieve those goals, there's a process around education and engagement. That's, we'll talk more about education as we go through, because oftentimes many family members aren't necessarily educated or up to speed on what it's going to take or what it means to be part of a family enterprise. You know, this is not standard high school or college or graduate school coursework. This is the sort of thing that is very specific to family enterprises and specific to each family. So I find that each family needs a process to educate and engage their shareholders, to engage the family group on matters that are really specific to them. Certainly at FBCG, we have a number of webinars, we have a number of courses around governance, effective ownership, you know, communication, like some of these big pieces. And there's always an importance of families adapting that and being really specific about what they need. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think we can all recognize that this is a marathon process. Families are working with these topics for years. It's not a sprint. It's not something that we need to do this year and get done. A lot of the families that we work with, when they develop educational programs, they enter into this process. We're talking about years worth of work. That means it's really important to have a sustainable pace. Sometimes there's accelerated times of work where we need to get done certain things. But certainly what we want to try to set up with families is meeting on a regular basis to maintain momentum and keep that momentum, but not so often that people are burning out or they say, I can't do any more meetings, it's too much, because then they tend to regress. So we really work with families to create a sustainable pace of meetings and input, knowing some people may be more involved, some people may be less involved. And that's a reality about being an ownership group and engagement. That there are different levels of engagement in the family, and we really embrace that and try to bring that out as a topic of conversation with family members. So we recognize certain people will have more involvement, even if the input is more of a democracy.
You know, one thing I would like to add to this is when we're looking at the first piece, because we're going to talk more about education and engagement, but when we think about the why, the purpose, and the vision, it's the most important thing that we do because it not only informs us, but it informs the advisors who our clients are working with. And that why can be totally different for any family and any group that is making decisions. So a couple of examples that I'll give is, you know, a family may be coming together as their family is growing and you're bringing spouses into the system. A family may have more family members that are going to be coming into a business. So they want to make sure that they're protecting relationships over time. There may have been a lot of past conflict in the family and confusion about roles. So their why becomes making sure that assets don't get in the way of relationships. A family may be closely intertwined in their community. So their why may be figuring out how they can intentionally make decisions about assets well into the future and still protect both in their community and philanthropically the things that they care about. So there are lots of different reasons that people are thinking about the why now, and more importantly, the why, what's their vision for moving forward, setting out very intentionally to do that with a purpose. So when we're working with the family, we're doing that very differently depending on who we're speaking with.
Yeah, I mean, I just worked with a family last week. They do $7 billion in annual revenue through their original operating businesses. They're moving from the third to the fourth generation. And one of the fundamental questions, and it kind of came out in the interviews and in the process, well, we don't really have a consolidated vision or a why. I said, okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but why are you doing this? You know, we started to really ask people. And it was interesting because there was a fair amount of similarity in their answers, but they had not yet come together to have that collective why. It was always, well, you know, it's been part of our family and our fathers did it and we work here. And so, yeah, those things are important, but that's not enough of a why as you transition from one generation to the other. And let's get the next generation involved in this too. So it's not just a why that's coming from the group of 40 and 50-year-olds running the business. There's nothing wrong with that. But what about the why of the next generation of these people in their 30s and 20s and even adolescents about why they may want to be involved. And when families can articulate that why and the purpose, it gives a North Star, it gives a reason that everybody can rally around to do this other work that Jennifer and I are talking about. I think we can go to the next slide because it speaks more about this concept of stewardship. And working with families on, again, a long-term program to really talk about clarifying the why, which the word that I'd like to use a lot is stewardship. That's the responsibility and engagement to carry forward the family enterprise in whatever form that may look like. So we try to emphasize, you can see in that the box on the left, that these initiatives of an education engagement are truly an investment. It's an investment in stewardship for the business. It's an investment in the family ties and connection, which we'll talk more about in a bit later. It's an investment in the knowledge and the skill building in order to do this effectively. I mean, I think you can all think of the families you're involved with that may have a pretty big range of skills and capabilities. Some people have great financial acumen. They're involved in business. They can really contribute on a financial level. Think of somebody who has a legal background. You know, they will approach things from a more, legal, attorney-based background. Well, I'm sure you can all imagine, some families where you have people who have nothing to do with finance, or they're teachers, they're artists, they're doctors, whatever it is in their careers, that they can all add a perspective, and there's a benefit to building knowledge about what it means to be a family enterprise, about what it means to have effective governance, but also the skill building to be able to communicate effectively together, to be able to make decisions, to be able to go along with family members who you may not like. We'd say in families, you may love each other, but that doesn't always mean you like each other. And I think that this can be particularly true for large families that may have had some interpersonal dynamics that have to be managed. That's a skill that can be learned. Ultimately, this is investment in protecting both the assets and in relationship building. The families that are willing to take the time and energy to invest in themselves tend to succeed over the long term. So all of the benefits, are clear. There's a unified, aligned, and committed ownership group. They say we know why we're doing this, and we're willing to do the work to support our continuity. Overall, more knowledgeable family members are an asset to everybody. I work with a family that has a very clear director development program, and that is developing the next generation of potential people to sit on their board of directors. It's clear to everybody that not every family member is going to be able to serve on the board of directors. I mean, that's a very small group. You need really focused contributors. The benefit, though, and the reason they've established this program is that they see that if they engage in education and development of any family member who is interested in serving on the board, that will support those family members not only in the business, but in their lives as well. They're able to take that and apply what they're learning and the communication skills, the things that they're doing throughout their lives and careers. So there can be real benefit to more knowledgeable family members, even if they don't all serve in those positions. Obviously, stronger family relationships are a benefit because you're developing that sense of collaboration and trust. And trust is a vital aspect of long-term success and continuity. Because without trust, things tend to erode pretty quickly and can be more and more problematic. As I'm sure you've seen in some of your clients, where even small seeds of distrust can grow and just become corrosive, unfortunately, in families. This is continuity with a purpose. This is families knowing why they want something and then the plan for how to get there.
Josh and Jennifer, we do have a question. So if this would be a good time to put that out there. So the question is a little bit of background first. We're G4, married in mid-30s with young kids. How do we get G3 in mid-60s actively talking about this planning and to be in the loop in all of this? So how can that younger kind of G4 generation engage with the G3 generation and get them thinking about this?
About engaging as a group. Actually, will you go to the next slide, Stacey? Because I think this is probably a good way to transition to
Absolutely
the next piece of the discussion. It's a good question. So to answer the question with wealth and family business, family enterprise, it's complicated, right? Because as generations, we may have very different perspectives on assets and how to make decisions about any assets in a family enterprise. So the other piece of this, right, is that G3 in the question of this question may have very different perspectives than G4 on those assets. One of the things that makes this often complicated is that when you're dealing with family enterprise and when you're dealing with shared assets, whether it's a business, whether it's investments, whether it's a foundation, whether it's shared homes, whether it's distributions, you're tied, intertwined with wealth and with decisions about wealth and how assets get deployed. That's very different than how Josh and I interact, right? Because we're making decisions as colleagues. We're not making decisions about money. And the reality is, as different generations, you may even have different perspectives and different values around money. So I very much respect and we understand that question, because the next generation is often the one that says, hey, we need to have these conversations because the way that you prior to us made decisions is different than the way that we make decisions right now. An example is a current client that I'm working with. There's been a family business for many generations and it still exists and it's quite big. But if you look at the value of that family business, which we know is illiquid until something happens with it anyway, other than distributions and people that work in the business, it represents probably 30% of the overall net worth of the family at this point. And there are also multiple family branches. The next generation approached and it was G3, and there were 3 siblings that represented the G3 families and said, we know you think that everything's been going fine, and it has for a long time, and we've built all of these assets, but here's this business over here. And this business, first of all, none of us are going to work in. Some of us may be in the board, as Josh talked about, but we have all these other assets that we're talking about investing in. And we have, some of us have kids who are starting businesses, and one of them's taken a loan and other ones haven't. And can you take a loan from the business? And what if you want to come into the business? And are there the same rules about coming into the business? So being intertwined with assets makes the discussion much more complicated. So what I always like to say is, the best place to start the conversation is to start the conversation and to just open their eyes to this is totally normal. It is very normal for next generation family members to feel that to protect both the assets and the relationships, it's essential to start having these conversations. And sometimes there need to be, well, I won't say sometimes, all the time, there need to be more guardrails and guidelines in place to protect both those assets and relationships than there were in prior generations. Whether those guidelines mean an investment strategy so that advisors know what the intention and around growth and risk and liquidity of those assets are, whether it's intention around education, whether there are shared homes and there need to be rules about how they get shared, whether there are discussions about how somebody comes into the business. It's complicated. It's complicated when you have assets and family mixed, but raising the discussion to answer that question and just saying it's different as we transition to the next generation, and we're asking for help and having these discussions so that we can protect all of these awesome assets that exist, and we also want to protect our relationships. So having these conversations will behoove everyone involved so that we hear each other's perspectives and put some more guardrails in place. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, I would say there's not always a clear, perfect way to do this. Sometimes it can be enough to say, family members get together and say, hey, here's something that's been on my mind. Could we talk about this? And you just open it up. It can be, hey, I saw a webinar, I read an article, I read a book, and it's really got me thinking about our family and our wealth and some of these things. And you just open up the conversation and see how it's received. Sometimes that's received very well and it opens things up. Sometimes, unfortunately, that can get shut down or it doesn't go anywhere. In either way, it's being voiced and it's starting a process that hopefully can advance.
Yeah, and I think that the three messages that sometimes I think about when you're communicating to prior generation family members is, one, is it's complicated, right? You have assets. Nobody likes to talk about money. It is extremely complicated. So acknowledging that. The second piece is being able to voice that we know and accept that what you've done as a prior generation is different than the situation that we're in now. So we're not saying that we can do it better. What we're saying is that we want to open up conversations that have not been had so that we protect the assets that we have, and again, protecting relationships. And then the third piece is really just normalizing it. You know, like Josh was saying, seeing something, reading something, understanding, hey, other people have gone through similar things and been able to have conversations in a facilitated fashion to make things easier. I think that that might be something that would help us. So normalizing the conversation is also, it's not saying there's a problem. This is super normal to need to have these conversations. It's complicated. Okay, so I think we're ready to move forward. Thanks, Stacey. So this really is just, this is a quote that Josh and I like to think about, is that when we look at next generation or anyone that's going to be owners, beneficial owners of assets, and when we look at people who are going to inherit assets, even for a young age, where we see people who are the most successful in managing their impact and their identities around wealth are people who are able to have these conversations. So they're not tying their identity solely to this wealth. They're able to have conversations around this wealth and look at it as something to manage, making intentional decisions and really considering the impacts on relationships and the importance of protecting the assets, not just solely to protect a bunch of money, but because there's an understanding, to go back to what Josh said before, there's a why, there's a purpose. The why are we growing this? What's our intention in growing this? Are we growing it? Are we looking to distribute it? Are there things we care about? Do we need some guardrails and guidelines? Have there been past dynamics that have been tied to this that we want to make sure don't become the only thing that we're thinking about? So the people that we see who are most successful in managing large amount of assets are able to really focus on the things that they care about that are beyond those assets and make wise decisions about their assets along the way. So let's go forward to the next slide. So to address this, when we think about assets and when we think about wealth, we like to look at it, and we really like this idea of having 4 types of capital, that this really isn't just about money, right? When we think about assets, we think about investments and businesses and money and enterprises and family offices and all of the things that we hear about or read about and that we're talking about all the time in the family enterprise space. But assets allow us to focus on all sorts of other pieces, and wealth can even be defined way beyond the definition of wealth and its tie to actual money. So looking at the areas of wealth, there are many things that wealth can allow us to do. It helps us to flourish with our human potential. It helps us figure out who in the family can be engaged in what and what they care about. One of the things I mentioned was a family who I work with, that entrepreneurialism has been a huge part of who they are. And there was a family member who really very much cares about mental well-being and how to deploy capital to not only focus on it themselves, but from an entrepreneurial perspective, use those assets to focus on building human capital. And there are families who focus on where in the business does somebody fit or not fit, but what are the things you care about even if you don't want to go in the business? So who you are as a human becomes a very big part of this discussion. It ties to the intellectual, which is really, what do I do with my career? Where do I want to develop? That doesn't have to be somewhere within this enterprise, but the assets allow us to think about what are all of these things that assets can do to support all of these varying areas of who we are. Social is another one, how we impact both ourselves as family members, broader to our communities, if there's a business that exists, our businesses, and even more broadly, philanthropically and bigger pictures in the world. You know, the world, especially right now, looking at the election, can be a very divisive place. So being able to deploy assets in a way that feels good and is giving back, looking at communities as small as family, as big as businesses or cities or towns, and as large as the broader world, is a great way for people to feel that they're putting their assets and their wealth to work. And then lastly is the spiritual. And when we say spiritual, that doesn't necessarily mean religion. It can mean religion. It can mean anything that anybody believes in. What's the bigger? What are the things that you care about? What are the things that you're going to find meaning in? So when we talk about wealth, the reason we like to mention more than just assets is often we get caught up in the discussion about how we deploying assets, but assets can be used and deployed in all sorts of ways other than seeing a portfolio grow. So we like to touch on this, and for next generation family members, this often becomes a big part of the conversation that makes this much more meaningful in thinking about what this means to them and to the next generations. Josh, anything you would add about that?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, I think that's a great overview, Jennifer. And I think that when I look at these and think of my work with families in this realm, these have to be approached on both an individual, sometimes a household level, and the collective level. That a lot of these questions and these lines of inquiry need to be addressed by individuals. What does it mean for them based on their unique perspective? What's it mean for us as a household? And then what does it mean for us as a family, for the collective? And oftentimes those things are aligned, but sometimes they are different. And where they're different, that can be a real opportunity, and it can be a challenge as well, but that's why I say an opportunity for individuals to recognize their own capitals and what that means for them, and for the family to develop a collective sense of how they're going to approach these capitals and how they're going to make wealth work for them. So it's really a both and. You need the individual aspect and you need the collective aspect of addressing these types of ideas.
It's a really good point. Thanks, Josh. So the last piece I'll say about that, and then we'll move forward to our last topic, is education. A huge part of how we work with families when we're thinking about next generation, as you can tell, is how do you engage in a conversation about how do you engage more fully in a conversation? We're considering that engagement and education, but it's really, what are you trying to do and to achieve? And that can be different with everybody. So, to start figuring out what your intentions are and creating education, discussion around whatever that is in a way that makes sense, given the knowledge of everyone involved. Engaging those to make sure that you're talking to the right generations about the right topics. So for the question that you already queued up, Stacey, perhaps the conversation with G3 would be very different than the conversation with G4. The conversation with G4, and I don't know this particular instance, could be more around how assets are held. What does it mean to be the beneficial owner of an asset? How do trusts come into play? What do distributions mean? How have they been made in the past? What are the opportunities to get engaged in conversation around growth and risk and liquidity? The conversation with G3 could be around how other families have made decisions around assets. What are the potential pitfalls if we don't have these discussions? Recognition of their perspective of why it may be uncomfortable to talk about these things. What does it mean to have a distribution policy or an education program? What does it mean to come together in a family meeting? So it's engaging education around the people that we're talking to. And like Josh said, you can start educating at a very, very young age. So you can even work with young kids to understand what it means to give back or what it means to control a budget. I mean, we've worked with kids who are in elementary school around these topics. So education can exist generationally in many different ways. Experiential education sticks better is something that if we just want to put a bunch of articles in front of people, or if we want to teach people in a way where they're disconnected, we will find that there's not as much of a tie to that shared purpose that Josh had alluded to in the beginning. So having experiential education where people can talk together and hear each other's perspective and co-create and learn in different ways is very important. So even though we're working often with families to create education programs, that doesn't mean just throwing out a whole bunch of stuff on the internet or for people to read, or sending people to talk to their advisors and understand what they own. It's very much an experience, and it's something that's important to us so that we know not only are they learning it, but they can communicate it to others in their family and the next generation. And then repetition is okay. So it can be strange to think about educating oneself about what you own and how to make decisions about it. And the more you do it, the more natural this becomes. So I work with a family where there were 3 siblings, one who was more engaged, the 2 others who were not. And they had very different ways of learning and very different knowledge levels. And what we found over time is where they were very uncomfortable even communicating with the prior generation in the room around these topics. When we have meetings now, it is extremely dynamic. We are talking about all sorts of things, how to deploy assets in the community. They're all very entrepreneurial. They're making investments together. They all have a really good handle on what it means to be a beneficial owner. They understand the roles of a trustee. They're doing so many cool things. And when we first got into the room, they barely even would talk because they felt like it was almost entitled to be talking about money. So the repetition part is that it's okay. The first thing we need to do to start these conversations is just start these conversations, and then we figure out where to go from there and get much more comfortable and better at it over time. So the last piece of this conversation is going forward and talking about the stuff we care the most about, which is the people. So assets are assets, relationships are relationships. So I'll let Josh wrap up in talking more about that.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Jennifer. And I think the reality here is that none of this works, in a sense, without strong relationships and a connection together. The other way of stating that is that if you don't invest in relationships and connection, everybody will tend to go their own way at a certain point. And if that's okay in the family, that's fine, that's their choice. But most families that we work with say, no, we really do want to stay together. There's a benefit to us doing this collectively, to being involved with our business, with our assets, with our foundation, with our family office together, rather than just letting everybody go their own separate ways. And in order to do that, and I mentioned this earlier, and that's why trust is at the top, you have to have and sustain trust among family members. And that happens over time. It happens with consistency and accountability. It happens with shared relationships. And when, not if, when trust is bruised, you have a way to repair together. This is a lot of the interpersonal workings of families that some families are pretty good at. Some families really struggle with. But in any case, families can always learn more about trust, about how to build relationships together, and about how to manage conflict, which is inevitable. Part of that is developing communication skills. Good communication skills help develop relationships and trust. And this is really active listening. It's appreciating diverse perspectives. It's being able to use I language. You know, here's how I feel, here's how I'm affected, rather than things that it can be more accusatory and unconsciously sometimes sort of erode the way people communicate. Good communication skills also can lead to transparency. Agreements can lead to transparency. Nobody feels like they're being shut out, or they're not in the room, or that secrets are being kept, or that there's the classic meeting before the meeting where all the decisions really get made and we're having the show meeting. That doesn't feel very transparent. And so transparency can come about as a result of agreements and structure and really a sense of fairness together. That helps build trust. Regular family meetings are really important. And again, the most successful families we see having a regular cadence of meeting together. For some families, that's once a year because that's what works for them. Some families meet together, and I'm really talking in person twice a year because that's what works for them. Some families meet quarterly because that's what they need. They need that sense of more regularity, and then even in between, they do video meetings. There may be video meetings on certain topics. It may be educational. It may just be informational. Whatever it is, the sense of regularity and consistency is important because it helps build connection, relationships. It supports transparency because there's information being shared. And it's really saying this is how we come together. As we've talked about, education is an ongoing process, and education doesn't always need to be financial skills or reading profit and loss statement. It can be around governance. It can be around communication. It can be around trust. We find that a broad range of educational initiatives and activities can really be beneficial. And as Jennifer said earlier, sometimes it's conceptual, a lot of times it's experiential. It's hard to talk about communication. We need to communicate in order to learn about it. And so having that be facilitated and people are experiencing new skills, they get to try it on, can be really powerful for helping families grow. So education is far-reaching and ongoing. And part of that is having fun together. Sometimes when we talk about family enterprises, we talk about these things that can really get into a business mindset, and that's appropriate, but that can't be the only way that families interact and build relationships together. I often say to families, how many different ways do you meet together? It's like, oh, well, we really only meet around the board table. Well, okay, that's good, but that may not be enough. So let's look at different ways you can meet together, and let's have fun. Because having fun builds a shared experience that everybody tends to remember. I worked with one family, and they were really starting to get in this rut of just meeting in hotels, in the boardroom, in the same way. And so we really encouraged them, well, why don't you branch out? Why don't you do a scavenger hunt in the city? Why don't you go to the botanical gardens? And it was interesting because the botanical garden seemed like a great idea. It actually ended up being a bust. It was not in season. It really wasn't that great. However, they had a blast together. And they always talked about that trip, not because of how spectacular the botanical gardens were, but because they remember how much they laughed. They had a really good time. They had fun. And so something that on the surface may have been a bust actually ended up being a really good bonding activity together. And it helped them in the future plan better outings and events. So it was really a net positive, even at one point where I was like, oh, this is going to go sideways, but it didn't, because they didn't let it. They still built relational capital coming out of that. And the reason we have this as a cycle is because all of this builds trust. And as you're building trust, you're building the relationships. We got one more piece on communication, and then I'm aware time-wise we've spoken a lot, so we want to make sure that we get your questions. And so I think I have touched on this, but healthy communication really is the result of active listening. People are truly listening to each other and appreciating those diverse perspectives. People are able to articulate their perspective. That's important. And doing so in a way that's not a monologue, but is concise, it's on point, and allows the space for other perspectives. What I mean by active listening is that people are really appreciating somebody else's view. They may not agree with it. That's secondary to appreciating and respecting somebody else's view. And managing conflict, because we view conflict as inevitable. Now, it can be minor conflict all the way up to major conflict. We like to avoid major conflict because that can be really difficult for all involved, emotionally, energetically. But I know both Jen and I view conflict as inevitable, and so we embrace it as something to be managed, not something to be avoided. So we can help families see how different perspectives are healthy. Let's do that in a way that's respectful, and that disagreeing doesn't mean that you have a problem. It just means you have different perspectives. So let's do that in a way that can still lead to consensus and help families move forward. So all of this around healthy communication is, as you can probably see, a really key piece of education and a piece of what we do together. I think this can bring us to our last slide, Stacey, and then questions. And really what we're doing here, big picture, when we talk about next gen and continuity and all these initiatives, is shifting the focus. I mean, you can read the quote, right? Not from the business as the glue, but to the family as the glue. The family relationships are what keeps people together. The business can only keep people together for so long. It's important, and we recognize it's important, but the money, the business, all of that is secondary to relationships. And when we develop the family as the glue, that's when families tend to stay together long term and can do the work of continuity.
All right. Well, Josh and Jennifer, that was wonderful information. Again, I know we're pushing up on time, but probably have time for a few questions. So if anyone has any additional questions, please do put that in the question box. I'll go ahead and we launch one over to you while we wait for any others to come in. Maybe just a summary in your thoughts and experience working with families as to how the generations do see things differently. Do you see any kind of themes and trends? And I guess kind of building on that, are there things that you would suggest families do, just recognizing that that generations do see things a little differently?
Well, I think that there are a few places that sometimes generationally people get stuck. So when we say stuck, we think that things that are harder conversation, because like Josh said, to us, conflict isn't necessarily bad. Productive conflict is actually good, but oftentimes, not to generalize, but the next generations are more comfortable communicating around assets and decisions than generations prior to them were. So we need to create the capacity to be able to have conversations about decision making, because we can't engage or educate if people aren't comfortable talking about assets. So generationally, there tends to be broader level of comfort in saying, hey, we need to be able to have these conversations, even if it's to just create a purpose around these assets and come together on our why. Where in past generations, it was more uncomfortable to talk about anything that was related to money. So that's one place that I think that we see generational differences. I do think that there often, if there was a business, whether it still exists or whether there was a liquidity event, prior generations often had a different relationship with that business and with the assets that were created than next generations. So the types of discussions that you're having around growing assets or protecting those assets, making decisions, creating guardrails, is much different than the conversations that have been had in generations prior. So those are two ways in which I could think. Josh, would you say others?
Two quick examples, and one was a family that at the beginning of every meeting, they read their values, which I think was really, really powerful. There was quite a few value statements. We're going around and reading them. Each person read a value, and it kind of passes by me, and the next person, they read their value, and it goes on, and he's like, he kind of leans to me and he's like, well, these are their values, not ours. And it just raised an eyebrow. I was like, wow. And I talked to him later and he said, it was written by an older generation in a different time. And we believe in a lot of these values, we meaning the next generation. We believe in a lot of these values, and we have a lot of our own that had to do around equality, some perspectives on gender and gender roles, and having less religious language in their values. And he was clear, it's not that we want to scrap their values, it's just we want to update them. And that led to a somewhat challenging process to update the values, because the older generation had to know, hey, it's not that we're scrapping them. These things are important. It's just these other things are important also. And so it was a real piece of balancing the generations. Another example with the family that I've been working with, I currently work with, is really undergoing first to second generation transition, where the first generation did a lot of real estate investment, and they were invested in certain categories. And the second generation is really saying, well, is that all we have to invest in? Couldn't we invest in these other areas too? What about private equity? What about these other areas? And it was interesting because for a while, they were really worried about what the first generation would think. And they were reluctant to bring up anything outside of what Dad had invested in, until we were able to create a forum that they could bring it up. And Dad was like, well, that's fine. You know, this is what I did. I did real estate investment. I did these things because it made sense to me. You guys have to figure it out for you. And it was really empowering, because the message was not, we will only and ever only do real estate investment. It was, that's what I did. What do you guys want to do? And his only worry is that you're just going to scrap everything that I've done. I said, no, no, we want to do real estate investment. It's just not the only thing that we want to do. And that conversation they had sort of avoided, because they're like, we don't know how this is going to go. Once it was able to be facilitated and it got out in the open, we were really able to bring in both generational perspectives and arrive at something that everybody said, yeah, this feels good. We have tradition, real estate investment, and we have innovation, which is going to be some private equity investment.
Thank you. That is really helpful. We did get, I think we have time for one more question, and we did get one in. So how do you make room for the next generation to step into a full leadership capacity? Do you recommend a retirement age for the senior generation leader?
So complex question. So retirement age makes it easier, right? But that's not often what happens. So Josh, do you want to talk through it, or I'm happy to, why don't you talk through it? Because I think you had something to say.
Well, just that, yes, mandatory retirement ages make that easier, but we rarely see that. I say there's no substitute for doing, and that you need to give people responsibility early. That can be small. They build trust, they build accountability, and they get increasing responsibility and leadership over time. But this is something that you can only learn by doing, and you need to step into that by the older generation giving opportunities, the next generation stepping into those opportunities. Some families, this is easy. Some families, this can be challenging.
And I think that's a great place for us to end the conversation, because the biggest thing that we see in family business is the idea of paradox, that there are problems to be solved, which are either or, and there's paradox, which is both and. So if you take the idea of trust and control, nobody that's running a company is ever going to turn it over to someone else and give them the keys. But building that trust over time while maintaining some control goes to what Josh was saying, which is do it over time, make it a both and, so that everybody feels comfortable when it becomes time.
Great, great. Well, again, to everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. Josh, Jennifer, thank you. Great information. If anyone had questions that you didn't send over that you think of after the fact, please reach out to your consultant. We're happy to reach back out to Jennifer and Josh, happy to make introductions there. And again, I know this is a topic that NEPC engages on with our clients. So just know that we and other organizations like the Family Business Consulting Group are here to help with this complicated issue of generational transition. So with that, we'll sign off. And again, have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Stacey.
Bye.